Greetings, welcome to the Diabetic Mogu podcast. On this podcast, we will offer standard and recommended practice of not only managing your diabetes goal, but how you can get involved in advocating for proper access to healthcare and bringing opportunities within the diabetes online community. It's Tino, a patient advocate and a certified diabetes educator.
I'm Hona, I'm a medical doctor. Together, we want to raise awareness, open a discussion about diabetes, share ideas, thoughts, different perspectives, and overall create a safe environment for everyone who needs to express his or her thoughts.
We'll be hosting a series of podcast episodes from people living with diabetes, caregivers, healthcare providers, researchers, and we encourage you to get involved, get engaged, and come up together to create the change that we need.
Greetings. So welcome to the Diabetic Mogu. We always have fresh advocates, fresh people, new people on the platform. So today we have the amazing advocate Colleen. So if you can maybe introduce yourself to the audience.
My name's Colleen Fuller. I live in Vancouver, Canada, which is on the west coast of Canada. I was born and raised on the west coast. My background is in health policy, which includes pharmaceutical policy research, and I do a lot of writing. I'm critical mainly of the industry and public policy makers. My focus, very sharp focus, more than 20 years now, has been on insulin, more broadly diabetes, and the tactics of the pharmaceutical industry to make money off of people who have diabetes and the failure of governments to support and protect this population.
So if you can maybe take us through your journey with diabetes, but just briefly.
I've had diabetes since 1969, so I've had it for a long time. I feel fortunate because I don't have any big problems with my diabetes. I know that other people do. I think that it's because I'm using the best insulin that I can get, that when you don't have good insulin, your life is very much more difficult. I use animal insulin. I'm not able to use any recombinant human insulin or analogs. I can't use them. I have a very bad reaction to them. I don't know why, and nobody knows why, which is part of the problem. They don't investigate why these things happen. So I feel lucky that I'm able to access animal insulin. A lot of people, in fact, most people in the world can no longer do that because of the tactics of manufacturers to withdraw animal insulin. I'm in good health. I'm in a loving relationship with my husband. I have a big family, so I'm lucky.
So I think this is the first time that we're hearing, like on this podcast, that we're hearing someone who is also using animal insulin. What's your take on the human insulin, and how are you one of the few people that are still using this animal insulin?
You know, one of the ways that people get involved in pharmaceutical policy, often, not always, but often, is because of an experience of very serious harm. I was involved in health policy, which is different from pharmaceutical policy, since about 1990. I worked in the health policy arena. I really enjoyed it. I was really interested and engaged. In about 1995, I was switched by my doctor to human insulin. I had used animal insulin since I was diagnosed in 1969. So I was 16 years old when I was diagnosed with diabetes. I had a terrible experience. I almost died on more than one occasion. I used human insulin for 5 years, and it almost destroyed me in every way. It destroyed my relationships with people. I couldn't work. I had to stop working. I couldn't take care of myself. My husband had to take care of me, which was terrible and humiliating for me because I'm an independent person. I was writing an article for a magazine in Toronto about clinical trials in Canada, and I didn't know a lot about clinical trials. I didn't understand the pharmaceutical industry really, except that they're greedy bastards. I knew that. So I was writing the article, and I thought I would just do a last-minute check on the internet. This is in 2001. I can't even remember what I Googled, but a transcript of a speech came up on the screen, and it was from a woman in London whose daughter had a very similar experience to mine. Now, I had seen doctors for 5 years. I was in and out of comas all the time. My weight dropped. I weighed 88 pounds, which is less than 40 kilograms. I was literally dying. And all of the doctors said that they didn't understand why this was happening to me. It had never happened to anybody else ever in the history of humankind. I was the only one on planet Earth who experienced this. And when I read this woman's speech and she described her daughter, it was almost exactly the same experience that I had had. I thought, what? How can this possibly be? What is going on here? I began to read about other people who were having similar problems. Not all of them exactly the same as I was having, but similar problems. And I became so angry. I began to read about how Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk had schemed and plotted to remove animal insulin from the market, not just in Canada, but globally, because it was so cheap. It was cheap to buy. It was safe. It was effective. Some of the animal insulins were the ideal. They described them as the ideal insulins, and those are the ones they pulled first. They removed these insulins from the market. This caused so much harm to me and to other people. So I learned about what had happened. I was very, very angry. My sister worked with a woman whose son had died after he switched to human insulin. I approached her very carefully because she was still grieving and talked to her about what I beginning to find out. She said, "Stop, I have to think about this." And I didn't hear from her for about a month and a half. I sent her all kinds of material that I had found. She contacted me a month and a half later and said, "I finally understand what happened to my son," because he had had a very similar experience. And so she and I began organizing. We organized 400 people across Canada who had similar experiences, or their children had, or their siblings, or their parents. There were just so many people. We demanded that the Canadian government conduct hearings to find out why this had happened. How could this possibly have happened? Parliament held 2 days of hearings on this question and recommended that the government of Canada ensure that Canadians have ongoing access to animal insulin, that there is a subpopulation of people who use insulin who must have access to animal insulin. And so today we have access to pork insulin in Canada, and we are one of the very few countries who has ensured that that's the case. England is the other one. I'm not sure if Australia still does. I think India does, but not very many countries support access. We had a victory over a number of years, after about 5 years, actually, of campaigning. And this is where we are now. I'm happy, but I'm still very, very angry that that has happened to people. That's my own personal story. But I'll tell you what I really actually think. I don't often say this, but I think that most human insulin products, they would be better for people who have an allergy to animal insulin or who are unable to successfully use animal insulin. And when human insulin was first introduced, they estimated that 1% of people who used insulin had allergies to animal insulin. And the market for human insulin should have been targeted at that 1% of people, or anybody else who preferred it, but that they would have been addressing a real need if they had targeted human insulin to people who had allergies. And they didn't. They wanted everybody to use human insulin because it's cheap to produce, much cheaper than animal insulin, and they're making profits like you can't believe. And so that was the game plan right from the get-go, right from the very beginning.
I'm glad that you still have access to this animal insulin because of what you shared. Now there's a campaign for insulin for all, but these campaigners have not developed the focus on the regulatory regime or the safety and effectiveness of the insulin available on the market in the way their predecessors. So what do you think should be done about that?
I think that the campaign for insulin access also has come about because people are angry that they can't get insulin. People who need insulin have to have insulin. That's all there is to it. And mainly we're talking about people with type 1 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is a different situation, that people with type 2 diabetes normally don't require insulin until they've had the disease for many, many years. And so that's a slightly different situation. But people with type 1 diabetes who can't access insulin, it's a death sentence. I think that it's a completely legitimate and really good campaign around insulin for all. What I'm concerned about is that the issue of safety and effectiveness is nowhere on the radar screen. And I don't know how other people feel about this who've had diabetes for a long time. I've had it for a long time. What I've noticed is that the burden of the disease has increased on people. And it's not just because of insulin, it's because of all the things that go along. The insulin pumps, the monitors, the this, the that. It costs more money and it requires more attention and focus to manage this condition. Why is that happening? Those are important questions that are not being asked. When insulin was first discovered in 1922, one of the impacts that it had was, of course, it saved people's lives, but it also created independence for people with diabetes. In those days, if you had diabetes and you didn't have any money, you didn't go and see a doctor. You just didn't. But if you were able to see a doctor, that's who controlled your life. The doctor told you what you could do on a minute-by-minute basis almost. And so insulin liberated people with diabetes to have an independent life. And now what my own feeling is, I don't know if I'm right or not, I'm just telling you what I'm observing, is that people, they go to see their doctors all the time. They go to get their hemoglobin A1C. I'm talking about North America and Europe mainly. And that's where the diabetes market is flourishing. They get all of these things that they must do to monitor themselves, to be monitored by a doctor, to have a team of people looking after them, and so forth. I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing, but it is not. Recommendations for how you take care of yourself are not supporting your independent living. And that's a problem. And people go to see the doctor a lot because they have lots of problems. I think that there should be more questions raised about that. You know, insulin is the basic tool. It doesn't matter if you deliver it in a syringe or a pump. And if the insulin is not good, it doesn't matter how you take it. It isn't supporting your health and well-being and your independence. My own suspicion is that the quality and safety and effectiveness of insulin has deteriorated over the last 30 years. The tools that people need in order to mitigate the side effects of insulin are more than they used to be. Insulin has always had side effects, and one of them is hypoglycemia. That's not new. It's always been there. Insulin now is more aggressive, unpredictable than it used to be. To organize your life around something that you aren't sure what's going to happen in 6 hours or 8 hours is a problem. And if your blood sugar is dropping and you don't know it's dropping, on animal insulin, you can say every day my blood sugar will drop at this time. Every day it will drop at the same time. And so even if you can't detect low blood sugar, you know that at that time of day, you have to start watching to make sure that it's not dropping too much. With human insulin in particular, and the analogs are slightly different, but the human insulin, you don't know when it's going to drop. You don't know what time it's going to drop. And if you can't detect low blood sugar, then you're in trouble. And you need you need a monitor so that you can test your blood all the time. You need to poke your fingers all the time. You just need other things to keep you safe. That is not independent living. That's being handicapped by the drug that you're using to keep you alive.
I'm out of words. And I wish I could just say, hey, Colleen, maybe you can take a step before that. Because the information, the data that they give to us, it's brilliant. And we never had access to it because we have never had anyone use this animal. And I think we also talked about this to say, if insulin was the all that space. I mean, with all these 100 years that we have heard, I don't think we would need to have pumps, CGM, if insulin was even that big. So thank you so much for raising that point. So are you using a CGM or a pump yourself?
I used an insulin pump for about 2 years. I used Humalog in the insulin pump. It was a disaster. I lost so much weight, and it wasn't because I wasn't eating. I was eating, but I lost a lot of weight. I had pains in my arms. I couldn't lift my arms up. I was very weak. I just had a terrible reaction to it. I would never use it again, ever. But the insulin pump probably kept me alive, because with the human insulin, I was using Humulin, I used Novolin, I used Humalog, I used so many different types of insulin. The human insulin, I couldn't take any amount at all. My blood sugar would just completely drop. I was handicapped using it. I couldn't use it. My doctor urged me to switch to Humalog. I did, and I could titrate the Humalog in the insulin pump. I was using 0.2 or 0.3 units per hour. That's as much as I could use. And I still was hypoglycemic all the time. It was a nightmare.
Following the announcement by the big pharma to lower the list price of insulin, what came to your mind? I'm sure millions of people, like even myself, we got excited about it to say, well, at least people in the US will be getting insulin at a reduced price. Mm-hmm. But I want to learn from someone, like we have like an extensive knowledge about how the big pharma operates.
Well, I think that campaign in the United States was effective, but it hasn't resulted in any meaningful change in regulations. And that's, I think, one of the problems. This is not the first time that the industry has lowered prices. In 2003 or 2005, they lowered the price of insulin in India because they wanted to undercut the price of animal insulin, which was very much cheaper. And so they lowered the price. They said that they were doing this out of compassion for people who needed insulin in India, but it was just a marketing tactic. And they also lowered the price in the United States also, probably in the 90s, late 90s, mid to late 90s. Both Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly wanted people to switch from animal insulin to human insulin, but people weren't switching because they thought human insulin was crappy, and so they weren't switching. And that's why they first dropped the price of human insulin to encourage people to use it rather than animal insulin. So they put the price lower than animal insulin. And then when people still wouldn't switch, they then pulled animal insulin from the market. So in the US right now, you have individual states in the US indicating that they want to take regulatory steps to control the price of insulin. The state of California has moved to partner with a nonprofit producer to manufacture insulin and sell it as close to cost as they can. The manufacturers are looking at this and they're not happy about it. They don't want there to be a nonprofit insulin available. So they've taken steps to protect their investment. And they're also probably doing it to preclude any regulatory initiatives to control the price. The US has no price control on any drug at all. They don't have price controls. And they're one of the very few countries in the OECD that don't. And so the pharmaceutical industry, not only do insulin manufacturers not want regulations, but the whole industry doesn't want regulations. So insulin was an example of an effective campaign that highlighted the hardship being experienced by people who can't afford to access insulin. And so the manufacturers kind of stepped back and said, oh dear, that's happening. We've got California moving in this direction. We've got the US national government looking at introducing some regulations. We've got individual states that are introducing or moving to introduce regulations. It's a mess and we have to do something. So they cut the price of insulin. And you know what? It cost them $5 to make a 10 ml vial of insulin. So they're not losing money. They're just making less of a profit. So they're not going to be suffering because they've lowered the price. They've only lowered the price on select products. I'm sure down the road that those prices are going to be ramping up again. And it was a victory that came about because people were angry and afraid of not having access to insulin. The other thing that I think there should be some self-reflection amongst Americans specifically, they have not campaigned to ensure that people in the rest of the world have access to insulin. They're only campaigning to make sure Americans have access to insulin. And we all do this in our countries, focus on our own country. But the campaign in the US needed to raise consciousness amongst people about the fact that this is a global problem, that 50% of the people who need insulin can't get it, either because the manufacturers aren't supplying it or because they can't afford it. And so there are problems in the world. And because we live in a capitalist economy, a world global capitalist economy, and that's how it works, we should not lose this opportunity to increase awareness about what's going on globally.
I don't know what to say. Thank you so much. I'm enjoying and I'm learning so much. Colleen, what made you to become an independent health policy researcher?
I have always liked writing. I used to be a filmmaker, actually. I made documentary films for the National Film Board in Canada. I was an independent filmmaker as well. The part that I liked best about filmmaking was the writing. So every film starts on paper. You write about it, you write what the story is, and then you go out and you try to raise money to support writing a script, and then you get the money for the script, or you get things going and the film gets made, and then after the film is made, you then write about what the film is about and why people should see it. So I liked that part of filmmaking more than any other part. When I got out of filmmaking, I started working for trade unions in Canada. I did that for 12 or 13 years, and I wrote. I was the communications person. I wrote the material for the membership. I also wrote speeches for the president or whoever was speaking. And then I wrote a book. I'll show you a copy of my book. This was the first book I wrote. Can you see it? Is it backwards? This book is about privatization of healthcare in Canada and how the free trade agreement with the United States opened the door to U.S. investors in the health system in Canada, and it wasn't great. So I wrote that book, and then I switched insulin. I started using human insulin, and I couldn't do anything except take care of myself. When I got better, I was interested in pharmaceutical policy. And so that's what I have been doing. I haven't been doing it as much as I would like, in part because you can't be an activist and a writer at the same time. It's very, very difficult. I've been really involved being the president of a community health center in Vancouver for 20 years. Not the president, I've been on the board, and I was president for 4 years. So I've been very involved in my community. I love the community that I live in. I really do. I've helped set up a diabetes program at our community health center. Last September, I got off the board. And so I have more time to begin writing. And so that's what I've been doing. I've been involved in other books. I've co-authored other books, about 5 other books. One of them is on pharmaceutical policy in Canada. Mainly, my whole thing is really on healthcare and pharmaceutical policies. Now that I don't have all these responsibilities, I'm starting to write more. So I'm happy about that.
Thank you so much for your contribution. My next question would be, when it comes to insulin, you wrote this article, when it comes to insulin, what counts as evidence? This is an article that you wrote years back.
Evidence, it's a kind of like a war zone. Ever since the introduction of human insulin, there have been questions about safety and effectiveness. Ever since then, the early 1990s, there was a class action lawsuit was launched in the United Kingdom against Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk for harm that was caused by their human insulin products. The companies began sponsoring studies to refute the claims of patients. So if you look at the period from late 1980s into about 2010, I would say, so this long period of time, when patients were claiming harm, that they experienced harm because of the insulins that they were using, the companies manufactured evidence to refute their claims. It was very paternalistic towards people who said, I used animal insulin. I never had these experiences. Then I switched to human insulin, and this is what happened to me. Then I switched back to animal insulin, and all those bad things stopped happening. Then you pulled animal insulin, and then I had to go back to human insulin. And these are the harms that I experienced. The companies had the nerve to say, you don't know what you're talking about. And the biggest complaint was about hypoglycemia unawareness, that people could not detect low blood sugar, which is life-threatening if you can't detect low blood sugar, especially at night. So the companies sponsored studies that would interview patients who claimed that their signals for low blood sugar were gone on human insulin, and they sabotaged them, as far as I can tell. And this was accepted as evidence. They got the patients to participate in a study, and they would give them insulin, but they wouldn't tell them whether it was human or animal insulin. And so you look at the study, this one guy in Australia, who is particularly obnoxious, did a study that showed that the patients who were involved couldn't tell whether they were on animal or human insulin. Therefore, they must have been lying when they said that their signals disappear. That's how the study comes across. And that is evidence. That is the worst kind of evidence. It's used to discredit patients who have experienced serious harm and is contemptible. To me, that's low quality evidence. It should never be accepted. Most of the evidence on insulin is sponsored by manufacturers. So it's like going to somebody who makes tires and saying to them, "What's the best tire?" Well, what do you think they're going to say? It's this one. It's the one I make and the one that costs the most. That's the best tire. And that's what the insulin manufacturers do. They also withhold evidence. So if the evidence doesn't support their claim that this is the best insulin that you could ever possibly use, they don't publish the study. So there are a lot of studies that have not been published. So the evidence that was used to support the FDA approval of Humulin insulin, for example, so you can imagine that in this time in the world, it takes about 48 months to approve any new product from the regulator. It takes years of clinical trials until you get to the point where you can submit an application for market authorization to a regulator. In Britain and the United States, so the clinical trials for Humulin lasted about 18 months. And worldwide, there were about, I think, 1,200 patients involved in the clinical trials, not all in one location. Some were here, some were there. So they were small trials of people. One of the things around an adverse drug reaction to a product like insulin is if you have 1 out of 500 or 1 out of 1,000 people who experiences serious harm, that's an issue. That's a serious issue, because then you're talking about millions upon tens of millions of people using the product, and how many will experience serious harm if it's 1 out of 500, say, or 1 out of 1,000. So when you have a clinical trial with 8 to 12 people, you may never see an adverse drug reaction amongst that group. Amongst the 1,200 people who participated in the trial, you may see 3 or 4 or 5 or whatever. With insulin, in some of the studies that were submitted to the Food and Drug Administration, the number of patients who withdrew was quite significant. It was about, in one study, I think I should check this, but I think it was about 100 patients. 7 of them withdrew. I think it was 3 or 4. They withdrew because of severe hypoglycemia. And so they withdrew from the trial. Now, what happened to those people? You want to know. What did the FDA think about that when they were reading the submission from Eli Lilly to have their drug Humulin approved? Well, they didn't do anything about it. So they accepted the evidence that was submitted by Eli Lilly. They approved the drug in 5 months. It took 5 months instead of 48 months for Humulin to be approved in the United States, and 5 months for it to be approved in the UK. So a very, very short period of time. They weren't able to really review the evidence in any kind of a comprehensive way. And yet those drugs were approved and on the market. And that set the tone internationally. Right? In Canada, it was the same, 5.5 months in Canada. So government after government after government allowed these insulins to come on the market. Why was that? Because the manufacturers said that fewer people will have allergies. That was their big argument. Fewer people will have allergies. And it's just like animal insulin. They said 2 things. And the second one was it was better than animal insulin. So they had different marketing messages. So evidence that supported the approval of Humulin insulin was very poor. There were indications in the submission to the Food and Drug Administration by Eli Lilly that there were there was evidence to show that people who used human insulin had weaker signals of hypoglycemia than they had with pork insulin. It was there. The denial by the companies that those people who were reporting weaker signals, that they were lying or they didn't know what they were talking about or whatever, it was in the evidence that was submitted to the Food and Drug Administration. As a consequence, not of that evidence, but really because there were patients who were reporting this as a serious problem. There were very, very few diabetologists in Europe, not in the United States, who were pointing to this as a problem. The Food and Drug Administration then did a warning on the label for insulin. They required a warning label saying that some people report weaker signals or that they don't get hypoglycemic warning signals. Even after the label was changed, the companies were denying that these weaker signals had anything to do with human insulin. So when you talk about evidence, if you want to know what the evidence is, you have to, first of all, be skeptical about whatever the industry says. Whatever they say, be skeptical. Even if it's true, you should be skeptical. Just be skeptical and do your own research. Look into the experiences that people have had with, in this case, insulin. What are their experiences? What are their reported experiences? I'm not saying that every report is a valid report. Diabetes is a really complicated disease. It's really complicated. And sometimes something will be happening that you think is because the insulin isn't working or it's not working properly or whatever. The fact that you've got a serious disease and your diabetes is out of control. So it's complicated, but you have to listen to what people say. And so that's one thing. The other thing, the tragedy about this also is that animal insulin is a comparator. And so people who don't have access to animal insulin have no comparison to make. They only have access to human and analog insulin product. Eli Lilly itself basically said beef insulin, it's very long-lasting beef insulin, which lasts for 36 hours, that this was the gold standard for a basal insulin. It was the first one that they pulled, the first animal insulin that they pulled from the market. It was called Ultralante insulin, and they pulled it. The tragedy is that people themselves have a lower capacity to understand whether an insulin is a good insulin or a bad insulin. It's as simple as that. If you have options in the market, if you're having problems detecting low blood sugar, you could use another insulin if animal insulins were available, but you cannot do that any longer. If you have an allergic reaction to human insulin or analog insulins, and a lot of people do, you aren't able to check to see whether it's the insulin. And if you used an animal insulin, whether you would have the same experience. Some people who are experiencing allergies are not sure whether it's the insulin, whether it's the material that's used in the pump or the material that's used in the syringe, whether it's the adhesive on their monitors, so forth. So all of these are complications. But the main thing is that the evidence that's provided by the industry is suspect right from the very beginning, because they're selling a product. That's what their job is to put together evidence that will support the marketing of their product. And so you have to be skeptical about that. You have to do your own research. You have to look for dissenting voices. That's for sure. And if your body is telling you something, you have to listen to your body.
Wonderful, Colleen. We cannot thank you enough for giving us this information that I'm downloading right now. If you could make a comment, the influence that these big manufacturers have had or influence the diabetes disease experience since the discovery of insulin.
I'll send you an article I'm just reading, which is pretty good. It's a very interesting article about how the pharmaceutical industry has influenced everything in the field of diabetes. It doesn't matter what it is. We're all subject to the propaganda from the industry about this or that and so forth, but they have influenced clinical practice guidelines. In Canada, there was a huge controversy about 15 years ago because the Canadian Diabetes Association was publishing clinical practice guidelines for doctors. And we got into a fight with the Diabetes Association because they didn't even mention animal insulin in the diabetes guidelines. And so doctors didn't know that patients had that option. And so we raised it with Health Canada, the regulator. The regulator asked the Diabetes Association to include a reference to animal insulin, which they did, but in a very grudging type of way. They basically say in the guidelines, you can get animal insulin, but nobody uses it. It's promoting the newer products. But anyway, the industry sponsors the guidelines. They fund them. Experts who put together the guidelines are also financially linked, not all of them, but way too many are financially linked to the manufacturers. So they all get together, they're all experts, and they all agree with each other. What a shock. And they publish the guidelines. That influences everything. Even if doctors don't follow the guidelines, they have a kind of a cultural impact on the way that physicians practice and the advice that they give to their patients. So that's one thing. The industry influences physician prescribing. They have done this, I don't know how many countries. I know they did it in Canada, the United States. They've done it in India. They've done it in England. I don't know what all the countries are, but when they introduce a new insulin, they then set up an educational thing for doctors so that doctors will know that this is the insulin they should prescribe. Doctors are influenced financially in other ways by the industry also, not just with insulin manufacturers, but there are lots of studies that show that when doctors receive money, when they're asked to appear as a guest speaker at a conference sponsored by a manufacturer, that it influences their prescribing. Insulin manufacturers have done this really significantly with insulin. And I don't know if it's more or less than other drugs, but they definitely do it with insulin. They spend a lot of time strategizing around how to influence the types of insulin that are prescribed by doctors. And that's why you've seen the shift from human insulin to analog insulin, even though the evidence to support a shift from human insulin to much more expensive analog insulins, the evidence wasn't there, but the doctors did it anyway, and in a really shockingly rapid shift that took place. So that's another area of influence. The companies also fund advocacy organizations. They provide funding to advocacy organizations to provide educational seminars to their members who have diabetes, and the diabetes associations have a lot of influence over public policy. So they influence governments in the direction that they go in. They're seen to rep patients, and they influence public policy. So for example, in Canada right now, we have the government announced, I think it was last year or the year before, that they were going to be developing a national diabetes strategy. Around the table, they have Diabetes Canada, which is funded by the industry. They have the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation, which is funded by the industry. They have the pharmaceutical industry, which is funded by the industry. And then they have politicians. These are the people giving advice to the government about how to develop a diabetes strategy. So the industry has its fingers in every pie. They have relationships with academic and scientific researchers. They fund universities. They get certain privileges that result from any research that results in a commercial product. So the presence is very, very overwhelming. In Canada, we had a public manufacturer until the mid-1980s from the same company where insulin was first developed in 1922. It was attached to the University of Toronto and it became independent, but it was still a public corporation until about the mid-1980s. And at the time, this company manufactured insulin, they manufactured other generic drugs, vaccines, and provided them at a very low cost to Canadians. We had one of the lowest national drug expenditures in the OECD. And now we have the third highest because that company was privatized. And we also have some of the highest insulin prices also in the world, not nearly as high as the US, but they're too high. And we have no control over the insulin market. We have completely given up any control over what kinds of insulins are available in our market. We have very little control over the price, and we're in the same situation with European countries. I'm not sure about other countries. Every country has a problem negotiating with manufacturers about what the price will be on their drugs that they sell in that country. We have the same problems. It's a losing battle. We're losing the battle also. So from my point of view, it makes people who rely on insulin cannot use another drug. You can't say, that's crappy, I'm going to use something else because I don't like insulin, I want to use something else. No, you can only use insulin. It's the only drug you can use. And so you have absolutely no control over what types of insulin are being supplied. You have very little control over what the price is that you have to pay to access the insulin. You have no control over a company who says, well, we want to pull that. We're going to withdraw that insulin because we're going to replace it with something that's more expensive. And we don't want to make that one anymore. This is typical amongst insulin manufacturers. Sanofi is an exception because they've only really got very few insulin products on the market. But Novo and Eli Lilly both have withdrawn insulins that were very popular with people, and they've just taken them off the market. And you have no control over that at all. We're very vulnerable in that way. We have to start mobilizing around those issues, I think.
And now there seems to be sort of a dilemma in terms of how they're getting involved. The number of patient advocates has grown significantly. What's your view on the pharma-funded patient advocacy group?
I think that there should be laws to discourage that. When a company puts money into a patient group, it's a tax write-off for them, first of all. They get to write it off as a charitable tax, and that should not be the case. We don't know how much money patient advocacy groups get because they're not required to report it. That needs to change. They should be transparent about the amount of money that they're getting from manufacturers. Also, advocacy is a really important function in society. For people with diabetes, we have a right to advocate. We have a duty to advocate. We have a duty not just to say, I need this or I need that. We have a duty to inform the public about what kinds of policies are helping or hurting people with diabetes. We have an obligation to do that. And so we should be publicly funded. We perform a public service by advocating on behalf of patients with diabetes, and we should be publicly funded. Now, I've raised this with the Diabetes Association in Canada, and I've asked them if they support public funding, and they said no, because they believe that it would compromise their independence from the government. But they don't believe that funding from the pharmaceutical industry compromises their independence from the industry. And of course it does. Public funding, it's not that it doesn't come with strings attached, because obviously it does. As a taxpayer, I want to make sure that if the government is putting money into anything, that it's transparent what it's for, what the benefit is for everybody, and so forth. Obviously, there are strings attached. If the government gives you money and says, we would like you to produce a report based on the experiences that people with diabetes are having with anything, we want it to be independent and objective, evidence-based, and so forth. You take the money, and that's what you must produce. There should be strings attached in that sense. And you should be funded to do advocacy for people with diabetes and not for people with arthritis, if you know what I mean. Strings that are attached by the industry are unacceptable. I have diabetes. They're completely unacceptable. For me, my interests are not well represented by the Diabetes Association most of the time. Sometimes they are, but most of the time I don't feel that they are. There were 45,000 people in Canada who used animal insulin when Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly withdrew animal insulin. And the government said not a word. They didn't say one single word until we demanded parliamentary hearings. And then they had lots to say. And that was 10 years later. So I think that we all need strong advocacy.
Definitely, we do need a voice, a balance everywhere. If no one is being critical about things that you're doing, you think everything you're doing is correct, it's according to the book. So I think you'd need people that will voice.
I just also wanted to say, this is going back a bit in our discussion. We don't live in a world where wealth resources are distributed equitably around the world. This report that you referred to by the World Health Organization at the end of the Second World War, it was after the war. It was the first World Health Assembly ever. I think it was in 1952, or maybe it was a bit earlier. And the delegates from the Global South demanded that the WHO ensure that countries had domestic capacity to produce insulin. And if it wasn't in every single country, that it would be in such a way that no country would be vulnerable to the lack of supply. Because during the war, there were supply problems everywhere, but especially in South Asia and in Asia. Those were the key places, and in Africa. Those were the key places where supply was the biggest problem. And so the delegates from these countries said, you must develop a strategy. We must develop a strategy to support independence. And the WHO never did that. Even before, by about the 1970s, Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly were the two main suppliers of insulin in the world. They weren't the only ones. There were many, many other manufacturers as well. There were 3 or 4 manufacturers just in Europe, for example. The WHO never acted on that mandate. They should be held to account, even though that was there was a half a century ago. But we're in this situation now where half of the world's people can't access insulin. It's not only because of the WHO, but they have observed this as it's happened. There should be some strategy developed so that countries are able to supply their own people. Now, in some countries, that isn't practical because there just aren't enough people there with diabetes to make it practical to produce insulin. But even in Tanzania, there was an effort earlier 2000s to produce insulin domestically in Tanzania. There was one of those groups based in Belgium, Tropical Medicine. I can't remember what they're called. Anyway, there's some part of the WHO. They were involved in these discussions in Tanzania to support insulin production there. I told you about this before. Tanzania could not produce genetically engineered insulin because it was too costly, but they could produce animal insulin. This is a question I have about manufacturing, using biotechnology to manufacture insulin. The promise from Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk in particular was that they would be able just to produce masses and masses and masses of insulin, and they would be able to supply the world. So they're producing massive amounts of insulin, and instead of supplying those people in the world who need it, they're looking for new markets in Europe and North America in particular for amongst people with type 2 diabetes, most of whom should not be using insulin because they get harmed more than they benefit from insulin. And there are more studies that are showing that. The global market is completely out of control of everybody except for the people who are making insulin. They're the only ones who have any control over what's going on. And so the WHO, I think, needs to begin having some serious discussion. First of all, they should cut the financial links between themselves and the pharmaceutical industry because there's too much money going back and forth. They should cut those financial links and begin to have a serious discussion about how insulin is going to be supplied globally. I know I'm in a minority position to say that the pharmaceutical industry should not be manufacturing insulin. They should not be allowed to manufacture it. They screwed it up so badly. It's way too costly and not very many people, half of people who need it can't get it. So they've screwed it up. They've done that for too many years and they should just be pushed out of the picture altogether. That's my actual position.
Wow, thank you so much. This is amazing.
A lot of people are going to disagree with me. I got to tell you, I know that already.
Because of the experiences have been so critical. That's why you're even independent, because you remain an untouched force, like a powerful force, and people still come to you, like big organizations, academics that come to you. You also have other talks that you're doing. Considering that you're an author of several books on health and drug policy, what should we be watchful for in the future? What are you working on?
Well, right now I'm working on a paper for the Indian Journal on Medical Ethics, and it's about the impact of biotechnology on the insulin market. It covers some of the issues that we talked about today. I'm not sure when that will come out. I haven't finished the paper yet. I'm still working on it. I've been wanting to write a book for a long time. It's a hard book for me to write about insulin because the experience that I had was quite traumatic. It's hard to write about it. I can talk about it for 5 minutes or whatever, but to write about it and about the anger that I feel towards industry and towards governments, towards different organizations, it's really hard to write when you're that angry. I don't mind being angry. I think anger is good. Anger can fuel you, push you to do good things, but you can't be angry all the time. And so writing a book about what happened is visiting a time when I was really angry. So that's hard. I'm mainly doing articles right now. If I live long enough, maybe I'll write a book about it. I'm not sure. I'm also involved with a group at the University of British Columbia called the Therapeutics Initiative. I'm on the steering committee the TI, as it's called, Therapeutics Initiative, was set up in the mid-1990s to make recommendations to the government about what drugs should be funded and what drugs should not be funded. I'm working with them, pushing for greater focus on diabetes drugs, especially insulin. So they're beginning to move in that direction, which I'm happy about. I'm also participating in a study on treatment strategies for people with type 2 diabetes who have mild diabetes or who have so-called pre-diabetes. There has been a history of very aggressive and very early treatment for that population. There is evidence now that a lot of that has caused more harm than good. For example, older people particularly experience very severe hypoglycemia with insulin and with some other diabetes drugs. It incapacitates them and undermines their safety and quality of life and their lives, actually. So that's one thing I'm doing.
It's an honor and a privilege to have you. I don't know if you have last words that you may have.
One thing I think that we sometimes forget, because we're maybe a bit intimidated by the knowledge of health professionals, scientists, and so forth. We live in a period of history where we're told that we're not entitled to anything, basically, that you have to earn what you get, that you're not entitled to anything. And even the word entitlement is used in a pejorative way. Well, he's got an entitlement mentality, as if he thinks he has a right to something. Well, we do have rights and we do have entitlements. Partly what movement to lower insulin prices in the United States was motivated because people felt that they had a right to access this medicine that their lives depend on. But we also have a right to really high quality of life, really over the last century, because of more knowledge about what makes us healthy, clean water, not working too hard, not being poor, not being subject to racism, not being subject to misogynistic men, whatever. We know that these things all contribute to our health and that we have a right to live in a world without sexism, without racism, without poverty. All of these things are important. We have a right to it. And as people with diabetes, we also have a right to have the absolutely best, safest, and highest quality of insulin that we need. It isn't just the price, it's also the actual quality of the medicine that we need. And we should be weaving that into our narrative. We have a right to a low price and we have a right to the best insulin that can be made. That's one thing. I think that those of us who are in higher income countries need to learn more about what is going on in not just the global south and also not just in high income countries. If you look at Canada, the places where the rate of diabetes is highest is in the poorest neighborhoods. And that's mainly type 2 diabetes. And that's because type 2 diabetes is linked to poverty and also racism. And so those are communities of color there who are more exposed to poverty, more likely to be living in low-income neighborhoods and so forth. Racialized communities are vulnerable for lots of different reasons, and that's one of them. But we need to find out more about it. We have to learn more about how other people are living, what the challenges are that people have.
So thank you so much, Colleen, for being our guest today.
Thank you.
People will learn a little bit more things, like a different perspective, things we didn't know, like especially about the animal insulin and the things that has been happening in the industry, people that we might not really know because we are not researching about it or we didn't care much to know about it. Now that you've raised an alarm about it, I think it's something that we need to pay attention to. So thank you so much for opening our minds. And
thank you very much.